In 1989, Nintendo released Mother for the Famicom. It was never brought overseas, despite a full translation having been made. That translated version would later find its way onto the internet under the name EarthBound 0, but it wasn't until June of 2015, 25 years since the game's creation, that Nintendo finally decided to give the title an official Western release, under the new name of EarthBound Beginnings. The Mother series is an interesting one. Japanese humanoid Shigesato Itoi serves as designer and director on the games, which is probably super cool for Japanese people who happen to know who he is, but overseas he's only known for these games, which is to say he isn't known at all. Mother was only released in Japan. Mother 2 was released in America as EarthBound on the SNES, but didn't come to Europe until 2013. Mother 3 on the Game Boy Advance was again a Japan exclusive, although there is a superb fan-made English translation online. It was a real head-scratcher then, when Ness from EarthBound appeared as a playable character in the original Super Smash Bros., fighting alongside Mario and Pikachu, like everyone knew who he was. Lucas from Mother 3 joined him in Super Smash Bros. Brawl for the Wii, despite a complete lack of games from their series having ever been released in Europe. You can even buy Lucas as DLC for Smash 4, but screw that, I ain't made of money. I'll stick to my vaguely Lucas-looking Mii fighter. With such limited Western representation, you'd think that the Mother series must be one of those totally whacked out Japanese things where you look up schoolgirl skirts and shoot lasers at giant floating naked bodybuilders in space, and they could only now, after 25 years, dare to release the NES original into the wild. Actually, EarthBound Beginnings is a turn-based RPG set in the contemporary United States. The map isn't accurate or anything. The closest you get to a real place is the haunted town of Spokane, but it makes for a fairly unique scenario, especially during a time when your options were either Dragon Quest or Dragon Quest II. Instead of fighting slimes and goblins, you fight dogs and hippies. Instead of a magic sword, you use a baseball bat. Instead of health potions, you eat hamburgers. Instead of spooky dungeons crawling with rats and pathways that lead nowhere, you have abandoned factories filled with rats and pathways that lead nowhere. That's a big plus for the game's novelty factor, but it hides an incredibly basic game system underneath. Enemies right outside your front door can hit hard, and the openness of the map and high encounter rate provide a long, slow grind. You gain magic spells, you gain psionic powers as you level up, but a lot of them just aren't worth using. Mana is limited, and offensive spells bounce wildly from less damage than just hitting them to total annihilation. There are some interesting quirks that can spice the fights up, like enemies sometimes wasting their turns doing silly things, or car exhaust fumes giving your character an asthma attack, but combat in EarthBound Beginnings is rarely, if ever, engaging. There are difficulty spikes galore. Single encounters can wipe out the entire party, and if an enemy dies mid-round, characters will try to attack the empty space where they once were, so you can't just mash the A button every fight, but it's almost always more efficient to just bash enemies to death rather than try any fancy stuff. You spend the majority of the game without any way to revive dead teammates in the middle of a dungeon, and mana recovery items are extremely rare, so you're essentially forced into a conservative playstyle anyway. There are very few boss fights, and most of them are gimmicked for story purposes, so the game doesn't flow exceptionally well when it comes to segregating chapters of the story into individual challenges. Dungeons end unceremoniously without an epic showdown or big payoff, leaving you to think, wait, that's it? As you abruptly learn a melody without really accomplishing anything. The story is as clumsily put together as the combat. After an incredibly vague prologue, you aimlessly wander about the world on foot and later by train, meeting people, solving problems, and beating up baddies. After a while, you reach the otherworldly town of Magicant, where the Queen tasks you with collecting 8 melodies, although by the time you talk to her you already have 3 of them. There's very little connecting the game's individual locations and scenarios together as you hop from town to town, getting into trouble and coincidentally attaining your goals. A surprising amount of the game is totally optional, with superfluous towns and 2 of your 3 potential party members not being technically necessary to complete the game. I would say this rewards exploration, but the overworld maps are huge and there is little to no useful treasure lying around as you might expect in an RPG. In fact, the shop in Magicant sells all the accessories in the game right off the bat, and there are pitifully few weapons to buy, so you'll be using the same gear for 90% of the game, which further amplifies the grinding, punishing battles as your strength only increases slowly over time. The game does offer some reprieve though. You can walk back to Magicant to rest whenever. There is a limitless supply of healing items, although your inventory is aggravatingly small, and you're never too far from your next objective, whether you realize it or not. Talking to people on the street for information is standard in games like this, but sometimes you'll catch a cold from strangers. Funny the first time, but having to go to the hospital and heal just for asking around town in an RPG can get annoying, as can accidentally buying the myriad useless joke items in the game. I suppose that point will inevitably come down to your individual tolerance for amusing but otherwise pointless content, although given the NES's limited space for data and dialogue, I personally find the really wacky stuff to be just short of entertaining. The characters don't get quite a big enough chance to make an impact or show their personality, which makes talking to NPCs far less enjoyable than it would later become in EarthBound, where they could stuff the thing full of goofy junk. In EarthBound Beginnings, though, it trips over the line from amusing to frustrating. The limited interactions lead to a feeling of half-emptiness. You never seem to get the full story of what's going on, poking into a town's affairs just long enough to see something weird and learn a new melody before moving on. That might actually be intentional, to create a sort of nostalgic, ephemeral vibe, but it leaves the game's overall story feeling very thin. The ending, and indeed the entire plot, seems to jump up out of nowhere and fade away just as quickly, leaving nothing behind but a fuzzy memory of the adventure. EarthBound Beginnings is not a very intricate game mechanically. In fact, it feels homemade. The awkward implementation of status elements, the erratic difficulty level, the background music that plays once, clearly ends, then starts back up again. It has a peculiar charm to it. That humbleness is a double-edged sword though. Whenever the game goes about charming you, it does so stumbling like a child with its shoelaces tied together. The tedious adventuring, cruel enemies and sporadic pace make the game feel clunky and unpolished. Originally released as Mother in Japan, EarthBound Beginnings might be a better name for it. You can clearly see where its Super Nintendo sequel's features, atmosphere, and story first began to develop. However, Shigesato Itoi's ideas hadn't quite reached maturity in 1989, or maybe the technology couldn't yet accommodate them, but either way, aside from the history lesson, EarthBound Beginnings just doesn't have that essential appeal to it that EarthBound and Mother 3 have. I'm glad it finally saw a Western release, and I'm glad to have played it, but I wouldn't recommend you try it if you haven't already fallen in love with the far better games in the series.